Joyce McLean, the author of Kenneth McKenzie Diary. And Joyce, can you tell us who was Kenneth McKenzie?
Kenneth McKenzie was my great-great-grandfather. He was born in Scotland and immigrated to Ontario first around 1841 and started farming in Ontario. He later took a number of trips to Manitoba and in the end he established a farm at Burnside, which is just a few miles west of Portage-la-Prairie. He wrote a diary that describes 4 of these trips that he made back and forth between Guelph and Portage-la-Prairie.
Right. So in this Kenneth McKenzie Diary, there is his trips from Guelph to Portage-la-Prairie, actually to Burnside,
Yes.
to set up his farm, which was one of the first farms that were set up at that time.
Yes, he was one of the first farmers to settle the land in that area.
Right. And so this was 1869 to 1870. And that was a historic time in Canadian history. And can you tell us a little bit more about that time in Canadian history?
Yes, it was a pivotal time in history when you think that Canada itself was only born in 1867, so that's only 2 years in advance of the diary. And Manitoba became a province later in 1870. So the diary covers that period where the territory was being transformed into the province Manitoba.
Right, and some of the essential historical value that the journal brings for Canadian history is that there were actually some meetings between Kenneth McKenzie and Louis Rial at that time, as well as other interesting facts related to that period. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, certainly growing up, Louis Rial is a historical figure that we all learn about. Much to my surprise, when I first read the diary, was that my great-great-grandfather had met Louis Rial on a number of occasions. And in fact, he went on several occasions to argue having some of his neighbors freed from prison. And Louis Rial agreed to that on a couple of occasions that are mentioned in the diary.
Right, and the journal gives an account of Kenneth McKenzie trips to establish the farm. So there's 4 of them, as we talked about. Also brings us some information about those encounters. Is that correct? Is that?
Yes, and something again that I was not aware of before reading the diary was that Kenneth McKenzie actually was a part of the convention that met in advance of Manitoba becoming a province. There was a convention that worked out the conditions for the territory to join Canada as the province of Manitoba.
Very interesting time.
He was part of that. So the diary also covers his impressions of some of the things that happened during the convention.
Wonderful. So there is a lot to learn from this diary, from those historical encounters and his contribution to it, to what the life was during this time, including some prices for certain items that he needed for his trip. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, one of the things that I found surprising was the prices of some things that he paid for, and he mentions how much he paid for this and that he bought. Some items, household items that he bought along the way, that were relatively inexpensive, like, a pot or something might have been $1 or less. On the other hand, some things were more expensive than I expected. For instance, he mentions buying an ox at one point that was $60. I thought $60 at that time must have been an enormous sum of money.
Right, quite expensive for that time.
Yes, and on another time, on one of his trips, he got his watch cleaned, and that cost $2, which I thought was perhaps relatively expensive compared to some of the other things that he bought.
Very, very interesting. And what are some of the things that surprised you in reading the diary to begin with?
Well, I guess I was surprised at how they traveled such huge distances, which could not have been easy in those days. When I was growing up on the farm that was established in Burnside, if our family was traveling to Winnipeg, which was about 60 miles away, it was considered an all-day expedition. But on numerous occasions, Kenneth McKenzie went on horseback between his farm and Winnipeg. And, our family probably would have thought long and hard before we decided to make this trip. So I was amazed at how often he made that trip.
Yes, and you were mentioning that during this time, perhaps one of these trips or something around, they lost their horses. They woke up. What was that story?
Yes. On one of these trips, they were camping along the way, and often they didn't have tents. They were just sleeping in the open. But they woke up one morning to find that their horses had bolted. So I found it amazing that they had to go searching for these horses, and they eventually found them 4 miles away. I'm wondering how long it would take and in how many different directions they would have to go before they found in which 4 miles the horses had traveled.
It could have easily been a whole day job.
Yes. On another occasion, he was traveling from Ontario back to his farm. He was in Minnesota. He always went through Minnesota, Stillwater, Minnesota, because he had a brother who had a farm in Stillwater. So that was always part of his journey, that he would stop there and visit with him. And he had left one of his daughters back on the farm, but she had gotten married just a few days before he was making this journey, and she was making her journey from Winnipeg down into Minnesota with her new husband. And he just happened to hear her voice across the river. And then, so he crossed the river and met up with her. But I thought it was amazing. In those days, they just, how did they find their way? There, wouldn't be detailed maps on how to get there, but they set out and somehow found their way every time.
Absolutely. Very, very impressive and interesting. And there was also a time when Kenneth McKenzie had to leave his fairly young kids for the winter, right?
Yes. Now that was something that I heard about in my family, and it actually predates the diary. He had made at least one trip, and it may have been two trips that he made before 1869. And so he went out with his two sons and left them there over winter. So they did build a cabin in the fall, and he set up his sons there and left them over winter while he traveled back to Ontario. Now that I read the diary and look at the dates of their birth, these boys must have been aged 14 and 16, that he left in the middle of the prairies. There wouldn't have been anybody around. That's amazing that you would expect children that age to make their, to survive in those conditions.
Of course. Very, very young. Impressive again.
Yes.
What does the original diary looks like? What does it look like? And when did you first came into possession of it? And
it is a leather-covered notebook that overlaps with a thing that goes through. It is written in pencil, and so it is somewhat faded now, and it was a little bit difficult to transcribe, to read everything that was there. In addition, the writing style is a little bit different than today's style. Particularly the capital letters were often hard to decipher. It was amazing, but it was hard to decipher, whether it was a B or an N. Like, they were so stylish.
So it must have took you a while to decipher all the contents of the diary. And
yes, and when I started this, I never thought that it would take me the number of years that it has. But I will give my husband, Grant McLean, a lot of credit for helping with the research. Because, again, the vocabulary, much of it was unfamiliar to us, either because of that time period or farming implements at that time. Some of the grains were unfamiliar. Even though I grew up on a farm, there were some names of grains that we had not heard of before.
yes.
And so Grant did a lot of research and figuring out what this vocabulary was. And so sometimes it took a bit of deciphering to figure out what was actually written.
Of course. And how long was that process from the moment that you decide to decipher the journal till the moment you publish the book?
The diary had been in my mother's possession, and my sister Gwen Brugger is, I guess, the member in the family that holds all of our historical things. So I borrowed the diary from her in 2013. And as I say, I've stopped and started, and it took me much time. But this year I finally finished it.
Of course. And you had the book in hand for the first time just a couple of days ago.
Yes, I got one copy for my approval from the printers, and so I'm hoping to have more copies very soon.
Very, very exciting. And where can people go to learn more about Manitoba history and about the Burnside district and the families that there were in that area?
First of all, online, of course, there's much information, and the Manitoba Historical Society has a very nice website, and a section of that is called Memorable Manitobans, and in there you can look up names, and they document all kinds of names. Kenneth McKenzie is among that. Again, that was a useful resource for me. because if I was having trouble deciphering a name, sometimes I could go into Memorable Manitobans and figure out who it was from that and the spelling of names.
Right, and there is the Thread of Pioneers, which you mentioned.
Yes, the Thread of the Pioneers was published in about 1931 or 1932. And it was a book of all of the early settlers around the Portage la Prairie area. So again, it is organized by families, and it gives a lot of information about particular families.
Right, and there was another one that you were mentioning, the Beside the Burn.
Yes, Beside the Burn is a relatively new book. It was published around 1990. And the Burnside district had organized this. So again, it is a history of the families in Burnside.
Beautiful.
So again, and I even have a place in that book, but it goes all the way back to Kenneth McKenzie and
Nice.
all of the people since then.
Those are very good references for people who want to learn more. And then, of course, read the Kenneth McKenzie Diary. Joyce McLean, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to read myself one more time the book a little bit more closely, and I hope gets into the hands of many people who are passionate about Canadian history and Manitoban history.
Thank you.